Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am Jewel Davis, chair of the North Carolina Library Association's Roundtable for Ethnic Minority Concerns, REMCo. We are continuing our REMCo Culture Conversation series with a presentation today on building diverse collections for K-12 students. And usually I am helping to host the series, so I'm very excited today to be talking with you about a topic that I'm really passionate about. And so let me stop myself and do a little bit of housekeeping before I keep going. I hope that you all can hear me okay. If you can't, please put in the chat box any audio issues that you may be having. My colleague Jackie is helping to co-host and help you with any issues you may have. And if you haven't found the chat box yet, if you hover at the bottom of the screen, there are some menu items for you, including a chat. Okay, so I will be presenting for about 40 minutes and then we'll open up for questions. And so I'll start by sharing my screen. Okay, so if you can't see my screen or hear me again, make sure to put in the chat box. If it's disappeared on you, hover over the screen and you should be able to find it. And you can double click on the presentation to make it not take up your whole screen. So just briefly a bit about me outside of REMCo. Again, I'm Jewel Davis, and I am the education librarian at Appalachian State University, and I work in a pre-K through 12 curriculum materials center, and I primarily work with pre-service teachers and practicing teachers and media specialists. And I have collection development and research interests in diversity in youth literature with specific research focus on representations of race and ethnicity in young adult speculative fiction. So all the genres that have the least amount of diverse representation with most of the problems is what I like to focus on. But today I will be talking with you about the history of what we are now calling the diverse books movement, strategies and tips for finding and evaluating diverse titles, and I'll end with some popular and upcoming title suggestions. And so before I get started, I just want to explain that the information in this webinar comes from research that I have conducted, and it leans also heavily on the work that many youth advocates have done to keep this conversation going. And there is a wide network of folks out there today that are putting in the work on many different areas within this broad topic of diversity in youth literature. So although this presentation is focused primarily on racial and ethnic diversity, many of the strategies apply to other types of diversity, and the resources that I'll provide for you with the recording at the end will highlight those types as well. So I hope in the end, when we open up for questions and conversations, that we can all share and add our input and expertise, because I know many of you are bringing some knowledge to the table on these topics and issues. So I would like to begin with this illustration that was commissioned by Sarah Park Dallin and Molly Beth Griffin and illustrated by David Hike. And this illustration shows how recently published youth literature represents the race and ethnicity of US children. And these statistics come from an organization called the Cooperative Children's Book Center, the CCBC, and they've been counting representation for race and ethnicity since 1985. And so in 2015, around 3,000 books were published. And as you can see, the youth literature publishing industry is very overrepresented by white characters and books and very underrepresented for minority populations. And our 2016 percentages are slightly higher, but they're still very low considering the makeup of our actual populations. So this graphic, while is a few years old now, is still very relevant to where we are today. And the CCBC usually updates their statistics sometime in February. So the 2017 statistics will be published soon, so we can see with this new movement if there's been significant growth. And so this illustration has been shared widely, and I believe it's really helped to highlight the issues of representation that we're having today. And over the past few years, there's been a lot of conversation about this issue, but it's not a new conversation. So I want to walk you through some of the history of this conversation, because I think it's really important as advocates and allies to know our history and what has come before what we're now calling this modern renewal of diverse books. So this is a timeline that shows some of the bigger voices in this conversation surrounding diversity in youth literature. And there are many, many folks who have contributed to this conversation, and I could talk all day about those folks, but these are just some of the ones I like to highlight. So I want to start with W.E.B. Du Bois, who over 100 years ago created a space in his magazine to counter negative portrayals of African American children in print. And so in his Crisis magazine, he began to highlight the positive things that African Americans were doing and their history. And he later created the Brownies book, which was a targeted magazine just for the children. And so starting in the late 1920s, books by and about people of color began to get recognition and awards. But even though during this time people and books were being recognized, there were still not a lot of books being published, and many still had inauthentic representation. And there also weren't published numbers to really show this issue of underrepresentation. So in 1965, Nancy Lyric published an article titled The All-White World of Children's Books, and she gave us those published numbers. In this article, she looked at all of the books published in 1964, I believe, and found that 6.7% of the books published featured African Americans, and they were primarily in folktales and historical settings. So 6.7% is very similar to, if you remember the graphic before, 7.6% of African Americans that we saw in 2015. So the numbers haven't really gone much higher, which is unfortunate. But she gave us the evidence for that. And along with the numbers, we also had a new council formed, the CIBC, which stands for the Council on Interracial Books for Children. And this council said, hey, we know there's not a lot, but what's out there, we want to review and make sure that people know if there's negative stereotypes, biases, or historical inaccuracies in all multicultural books. So this council was really important, and they helped to push a growth of multicultural books in the 60s and 70s. And so in the 80s, the Cooperative Children's Book Center began reporting their annual statistics. And unfortunately, when they started, they also reported that the numbers had gone down again. And so they have continued to report every year. And the numbers that you usually see in youth literature research are coming from them, the statistics on the different ethnicities and racial groups that are being represented in children's literature. So in 1990, Rudine Sims Bishop helped us to have reasons for helped give us reasons why this issue was important. With her seminal foundational article, Mirrors, Windows, and Sliding Glass Doors, she wrote that children need mirrors to see themselves in books, and that children need windows to see outside of their experience. And they need sliding glass doors to walk through and be a part of worlds filled with diverse people and experiences. And one quote that I like that I want to highlight that she said was, "When children cannot find themselves reflected in the books they read, or when the images they see are distorted, negative, or laughable, they learn a powerful lesson about how they are devalued in the society of which they are a part." So that really resonates with me and in thinking about identity formation and development of children and how damaging it can be for a child to see an inaccurate or stereotypical portrayal of themselves. So Rudine Sims Bishop gave us this really great metaphor to help us show why it matters in having authentic portrayal. And she also gave researchers a framework to begin to use to evaluate authenticity. And many researchers have taken this framework, ones that are researching in race and ethnicity and ones that are researching in other diverse groups, and they've used it to modify and create their own frameworks for evaluating. Um, so I want to move now to 2009 with Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story. And this is where a lot of people start becoming a bit more familiar and nodding their heads with the history of this, because Adichie gave us a really great story that highlighted the importance of minority groups telling their stories and the danger of single stories. So Adichie grew up in Nigeria, and she read books that did not represent her. And so when she began to write books, she wrote about characters that had blue eyes and snow, and she never had snow or saw blue-eyed people where she lived. And so her story shows that it's really important to have mirrors. So she gave more evidence for why we need more than one narrative to represent everyone. And she also gave evidence for the importance of counter stories, encountering stories that are negative, encountering stories that are stereotypical. And so more recently, in 2014, the late Walter Dean Myers and his son Christopher Myers wrote New York Times articles addressing these same issues that we've been talking about for so long. But these articles really helped to revitalize the conversation and push a call to action into trending mainstream social media. And Christopher Myers noted in his article, The Apartheid of Children's Literature, that characters of color are frequently delegated to historical fiction and not to adventurous or imaginative fiction. And that does a disservice to kids who want more than historical fiction and informational books. And so these narratives are similar to ones that we've heard before. Christopher Myers and Nancy Lyric were saying very similar things in very different times. So we've had these problems that keep coming up. But because of those articles, the We Need Diverse Books movement was birthed, which became a nonprofit organization that promotes diversity in children's literature and supports training for authors, reviewers, and advocates. And the hashtag Own Voices was birthed as well, which is an identifier of diverse authors writing within their own experiences. And it also pushed for more surveys and research on the industry. We have the numbers because of the CCBC, and so an outside look of what's being published, but we didn't have an inside look until 2016 when Lee and Low, which is a multicultural small press publisher, presented a survey to children's books publishers, review journal employees, and publishing staff. And they found that the majority of book reviewers, review journal employees, and publishing staff are white, heterosexual, able-bodied, cisgender female. So their study highlighted that the people working in the publishing industry and the reviewing industry aren't representative of what people outside of the industry are pushing for. And that has unfortunately created some real problems in reviewing and publishing that I will address in a few of the next slides. But I want to point out in 2017, I'm so happy about this, a new coalition was formed, the See What We See Coalition. They are under Social Justice Books, which was formerly the Teaching for Change organization. And this coalition was inspired by the CIBC, the Council for Interracial Books for Children, which ended in the 90s. So See What We See are a coalition of members who are doing the same kind of work. They're writing critical reviews, they're pointing out stereotypical portrayals and inaccuracies, and they're having critical conversations about this issue. So check them out, they're great. I'm so excited that they're here and they're doing great work. So that's a really broad overview of where we have come from in terms of racial and ethnic diversity in youth literature, with many, many other folks contributing to get us there. And so if you're interested in knowing more about the history, I've provided two really great resources, Kathleen Horning's Milestones for Diversity in Children's Literature and Library Services article, which goes from 1916 to 2015 and highlights some of the other voices and work that's been done. And then Edith Campbell's 50 Years of Diversity in Young Adult Literature, which highlights work from 1967 till today. So moving to the next part of this presentation, how as librarians and youth advocates can we take part to find materials and build up our collections to represent the youth who make up our society? And in beginning to answer how we find diverse youth lit, we must first acknowledge how some of our collection development strategies may actually be hindering our search for well-reviewed, authentic, diverse lit. And I am specifically speaking about our reliance on trade review journals. And so these are just some of the major ones, and I know there's many more that we utilize. And I've seen shifts in our reliance on trade reviews, but I know that they're still popular, and particularly for school libraries, they are used for justifying book purchases. And unfortunately, they are not always the best place to go for identification of diverse characters and titles and for critical evaluation of diversity in those titles. So many of our popular trade review sources have been in the spotlight over the past few years on issues surrounding their reviews, and some of those issues consist of what I've seen primarily in my research: underreporting or lack of identification of characters of color and Native youth in genres, particularly genres outside of realistic fiction and historical titles. So what I've seen are blanket statements of diversity, like, oh, it was a diverse cast of characters to describe the diversity, or statements like, oh, diverse groups. So not being explicit about what exactly is diverse about the title. There also have been issues of exclusivity, so lower amounts of titles being reviewed or represented in from small publishers or presses. And we all know that some review sources are a bit more exclusive in the titles that they review. And unfortunately, because of that, they don't necessarily represent where people of color and natives are publishing, because many of them are publishing in smaller presses. I've also seen, and others have called out, unfortunately, microaggressions and insensitive language being used to describe diverse elements present in reviews, where people are saying things like, oh, there's too much issue, or there's too much diversity, people demanding glossaries when there's Spanish words, reviewers saying things like, this character has too many issues, they're too intersectional in a way, they can't be Black, asexual, and have problems in their home life. So too many issues in reviews. And another issue is critical evaluation. Many titles that have been starred or praised by popular sources have ended up actually being problematic. And so I want to just take a moment for you to take a look at the slide here. These are just some of the bigger titles that have gotten a lot of press on from other groups on their issues. And there are popular authors in this slide. So it's not just unknowns. There are authors that are writing in problematic ways that aren't accurate portrayals that we know and that we love, but groups have called them out on it. And so I say all of this not to encourage you to stop using trade reviews, but to help you to see that if you only look in trade review journals, you will definitely miss diverse titles, particularly ones that are outside of realistic fiction and historical fiction because of the under-identification issue. And you will find implicit bias there that unfortunately continues today. We are still having our controversy over the implicit bias found in reviews. And I just want to take a moment to stop and just make sure that you all know you can chat in questions if you're having issues or problems. I'm keeping an eye on it, and I don't see anyone chatting in, but if you do, and if you want clarification, I'm looking to see if you have questions. So as youth advocates, we do have power to change these issues with our trade reviews so that our trade reviews can work for us. And there are a few ways that I've thought about to address this issue. And I like to use the TSA motto, if you see something, say something. So if you recognize problematic language, push back. Tell editors that this is not the way that we should be writing about diversity in our reviews. Pushing back has changed editors' reviews. Write and ask for more explicit diversity descriptions. And I add write because I know many of us write these reviews. So it's on us to add explicit descriptions. People want to know what is there. So saying, oh, there's a colorful cast of characters or there's a diverse group of characters isn't enough. Putting in the work to sift through and see what diverse characters are present is really important. And adding that into the review helps us, ultimately, all of us. And supporting diversity and training initiatives. There are many, many professional development opportunities from the actual review sources and from librarians like us that are talking and having these conversations. So attending those and learning and having critical conversations with each other, I think is really helpful in helping us to change the trade review issue. Because I know we're not going to stop using them. So how can we make them work better for us in finding diversity in youth lit? And so some of the journals have been working and changing surrounding these issues. School Library Journal has started to provide cultural competency training and putting out articles for their reviewers to use when they're thinking about reviewing and critically thinking about these titles. Voya has revised their reviewer guidelines, and Kirkus has actually started to identify reviews. Identify characters of color in their reviews, including white characters. So it's quite a difference to read a review that says white character John does this, because that's not what we ever see. So even though review journals have been working, there still have been problems. Most recently, American Heart is the title that has come under scrutiny for Kirkus, and Let's Talk About Love, which is a title that I'll book talk later from Voya, with an asexual character, has come under scrutiny for the damaging way that reviewers have written about these characters. So I wanted to get that out of the way and just letting you know about the issues with trade review journals, but how can we go beyond that? Where can we go to find and better build up our collections? A few strategies. My first tip is to purchase awards from titles from ALA's ethnic affiliate partners and multicultural divisions. So this first tip may seem like common sense, but I think it's really important to consider and include, especially if you have limited funds and you can't buy everything that you want. But starting with these places, the American Indian Library Association has awards, the Asian Pacific American Libraries Association has awards, the Ethnic and Multicultural Information Exchange Roundtables Coretta Scott King Awards, the Association of Jewish Libraries Sidney Taylor Book Award, and AUS and Reforma's co-sponsor Pura Belpre Award are all great places to start to build up collections that have people of color and natives. I also wanted to include the Stonewall and the Schneider because it's important to recognize our intersections. Even though I'm only focusing on race and ethnicity today, we are, of course, we're not just one identity or one thing. Many of us have many identities that intersect and overlap with all types of expressions. So I do have to acknowledge, though, what has most recently been controversy with the Schneider Family Award, in that problematic titles can be found in these award lists. Alan Say's Silent Days and Silent Dreams, which won the Schneider Family Award just this week, has been critiqued by members of the deaf community as having damaging portrayals, by members of the estate for James Castle, who was portrayed in this title. And so we have had controversial titles in the past as well. So just being aware that using these award lists, we can use them, but there sometimes can be problems with some of the titles in them. And so other ways, seeking out small and independent presses, continuing to develop our collection by looking at what these presses are putting out. The CCBC has a great list of small presses owned and operated by people of color and natives. And Monica Edinger has another list, which is a bit more comprehensive, of all of the many different independent presses. And I want to point out that this year, the American Library Association, all of their award books were from small presses. So in thinking about how sometimes these small presses aren't represented in trade reviews, it's really important to seek them out and to find out what they're publishing. And I've just listed at the bottom some of my favorites. Lee and Low, I mentioned earlier, is the largest multicultural publisher, and Anik Press is a Canadian press that's committed to publishing multicultural titles, and Cinco Punto Press, which is primarily focuses on US, Mexico border, the Southwest, and Mexico. So another tip is to utilize curated lists, reviews, and resources from organizations devoted to promoting authentic representations of diversity. It's really easy to find diverse book lists out there, but finding authentic diverse book lists is a different matter, and it takes a bit more work. So seeking out the groups that are doing the work to push out the ones that aren't problematic, that have non-stereotypical representation is really important. And We Need Diverse Books, I mentioned earlier, is a really good organization. They have many resource lists and title lists, and they also have an app which your patrons, your students can use to help them find books, to help you do reader's advisory. Social Justice Books is another organization that has really great lists, and the See What We See Coalition is under Social Justice Books. So if you're looking for more reviews as well, you can go there and find titles that are representative. And so another tip is to search for diverse titles in non-traditional places. These are my favorite, book blogs and Twitter, because this is where diverse voices are speaking out and doing so in more than 250 words that our review sources have to stay under. So I personally use many of these resources to find new titles, to find critical reviews, and I've listed just a few here, and in the resource handout that I'm going to provide for you at the end, I have many more, but I just want to point out that in the slides, I have highlighted two resources that have upcoming title lists. So Edie Campbell's blog has January 2018 titles that feature people of color and Native youth and February titles lists, and then Latinx and Kidlits has a 2018 titles post. But all of these links link to blogs and websites that promote upcoming titles and critique past published titles. And so these are just some of my favorites. I really, really like Rich in Color. They're really good about being on top of everything that's coming out and describing explicitly what type of diversity they have in there. Laura Jimenez's Book Toss focuses on graphic novel representations in graphic novels. And then I also included LGBTQIA plus YA and disability and Kidlit on the slides too, because they're great resources as well. Utilizing Twitter is really something that I have found very valuable in keeping up with unfortunately, all the controversy that tends to happen when people write outside of their experience and write inauthentic portrayals. And I know Twitter can be kind of not as accessible to some people, but I do find value in listening there. I don't participate a lot, but I do follow people who have really big voices. So I do encourage you to go use the social media spaces that are there to keep on top of what's coming out. And you can always follow your favorite authors, your favorite researchers, your favorite advocates to see what they're excited about. I think that really helps to inform our work in developing authentic collections. So there is so much value in these non-traditional collection development spaces because they really do help in tying into our final question of how we go about evaluating diverse titles. And so my biggest tip, if you leave today without anything, I hope that you remember my biggest tip for evaluating is that when you consider a book with diversity present, search for how people within the diverse group perceive the book. This is when I say this, sometimes people just say, oh, that's common sense, but our society tends to like to silence disagreeing voices. And I think sometimes we place certain authors on pedestals and books that are near and dear to our personal hearts are ones that can do no wrong. But it's really important to know that people within their groups know their stories best, and we should not silence them by not listening to them. They should be heard. Another tip for evaluation is to listen to conversations surrounding controversial titles. And so I've listed all of the See What We See Coalition members' Twitter handles. And from their Twitter, you can find their websites too if you're not comfortable with Twitter. But these people are having critical conversations about these titles. And I really value listening to them because I find things that I have not thought about from them when I'm looking at books that are from different groups and from different experiences. And so they teach critical conversations and they teach me more about the types of issues that I need to look for. There's also a group called Reading While White. They are a group of white advocates who have created a space for white allies and other advocates. And I really do want to point to this resource as one of value, because I know that sometimes being outside of an experience, it may be uncomfortable to have an opinion or to make your voice heard because you're not a part of that experience. And Reading While White has created a space where people outside of that experience can come and have critical, safe conversations about titles that aren't being accurately portrayed or ways to evaluate titles. So I do urge and encourage you to follow the See What We See Coalition members or check them out, and to check out the Reading While White page as well. I think they help us to see more ways of evaluating, along with my primary tip in utilizing anti-bias guidelines and toolkits for evaluation. So Teaching for Change has created, or actually updated from the past, anti-bias guidelines that we can use to help us when we're looking at titles that have diverse characters, that have diverse experiences. And they have examples of evaluation questions that help us look for things like stereotypes or tokenism or invisibility. So thinking about, like, is the story only giving us a single story? Is the story only giving us a stereotypical view? Are there tropes like dark-skinned aggressors or one-dimensional fixed side characters? That's kind of like tokenism. So the anti-bias guideline gives questions to help us sift through that and see if those issues are present. They also have questions that help us think about relationships between people. Are there minority groups in positions where they need to be saved? That is unfortunately a popular white savior narrative is seen throughout, particularly fantasies and science fictions, but also thinking about other relationships between people. Are minority groups delegated to supporting roles? Do they have power? Are they put into positions where they have no agency? Also, these anti-bias guidelines help reviewers and advocates think about the line between appropriation and cultural misappropriation. Being inspired is fine, and that's what makes literature great, but when it moves into copying elements without authentic context, that can be really damaging. And unfortunately, cultural misappropriation is something that runs rampant through children's literature. So I really do value the anti-bias guidelines because they help me to pause and think really critically about the various ways in which we can have materials that are damaging. And I have another link for toolkits, and that's from the Reading While White blog, and it's a toolkit in thinking about representations of books that have police in them. And while it's a very specific topic, I do encourage you to look at the toolkit that they provide, because it made me think about questions that I hadn't before in terms of looking at books that show police. And it also made me think about how we can start to evaluate literature on different societal issues that our children are facing, that we may not be facing. So I'll keep going and include nonfiction evaluation. I'm going to talk about that a little bit, because I think nonfiction doesn't get as much discussion as fiction with us, and I have this problem as well. But I think there's a perception that diverse nonfiction is easier to find and incorporate into our collections, because you can easily search for cultures, religions, countries, historical events with marginalized groups. But those books don't make up all the different types of nonfiction, and those books can also be problematic. So a few ways that we can approach thinking critically about representation in nonfiction is thinking about, for topics about history, cultures, cultures, etc., who is telling the story and who is being left out? Are there stereotypes or inaccurate information present? Who has the voice? Who has the authority to tell the story? Are there biases with information, particularly about Native history? Many people want to be allies and give their voice, but unfortunately, it can be inaccurate. And the recent controversy around the secret project is a good example of authors and illustrators who we respect and love, who have done extensive research but still not gotten it right. So approaching our nonfiction titles critically and asking these questions and researching to see if there's inaccurate information, particularly if it's a non-owned voices author, is really important in representing our cultures and our histories well. So another tip for thinking about general nonfiction topics, particularly for like concept books, is looking at the illustrations and photographs and thinking and asking, are they providing diverse or balanced representation? And so I have this title series as an example. I saw this at a conference and I was really surprised because I don't usually see people of color on concept book title covers. And so I looked more into the series and saw that it represents many different types of kids. And so asking ourselves, when we have a book that's about science or animals and it features people, is it showing a diverse and balanced group, or is it just white children? Another tip is to go beyond the popular histories, holidays, and food. We are more than that. So seeking out marginalized experiences, non-normative identities, and sensitive topics is really important. And so I want to end on this portion on having you consider these final questions. What stories, voices, and experiences are well represented in your collection and what are not? And what stories, voices, and experiences do you promote and make visible in your programs, classroom displays, and readers advisory? There is so much that we can utilize to help us better build up our collections. And I hope that some of the tips are new ones for you, but really coming away and thinking about what is represented in my collection and how I'm representing my collection and highlighting titles or not highlighting titles is really important, because we are gatekeepers and we are the ones who are providing these resources to our patrons and to our students. So we have to consider these questions daily in our readers advisory, in our displays, and in our programs. So hopefully some of these resources will help you do that. Okay, so I have talked for a very long time, and I do have some titles that I want to highlight quickly. I won't go through all of them because I want to give time for questions, and you can go ahead and start putting in your questions in chat, so I can get to them when I'm done going through some of the titles. Okay, so for picture books, I'm just going to do a few of my favorites. I'll start with The Big Bed by Bunmi Laditin. This is a really hilarious picture book about a young Black girl who doesn't want to sleep in her little bed, so she presents her dad with his own bed, which is a camping cot. It's a great read, and I hope you put it in your collection. They Say Blue by Jillian Tamaki is a picture book by the award-winning author, and it follows a young Asian girl as she examines the colors in the world around her. And Juno Diaz's Island Born is about young Lola, who, when asked to draw a picture of where she's from, the Dominican Republic, she has trouble because she doesn't remember. So she journeys through her neighborhood gathering island stories of music and beauty, as well as fear and sadness. A few chapter books. Many of these are probably familiar to you because they are popular, but these all feature diverse protagonists. Debbie Florence's Jasmine Toguchi series features Japanese American protagonists written by a third generation Japanese American based on her family experiences. We have the Jada Jones series by Kelly Starling Lyons. This is a parallel to Ivy and Bean, I like to tell patrons. We have Monica Brown's Lola Levine series, which now is in Spanish, which is great. The newest book is the first title that she came out with, Lola Levine Is Not Mean. It's in Spanish, so please buy it. And then The Carver Chronicles by Karen English follows young Calvin, an African-American boy in an urban setting. Some upper elementary titles, Front Desk by Kelly Yang, is about an aspiring writer, Mia, who lives in a motel where her parents hide immigrants. And Karen Callender's Hurricane Child follows Caroline Murphy, a 12-year-old Black girl who lives in the U.S. Virgin Islands and is convinced that she is cursed because she was born during a storm. A few middle grade titles. All of these I'm excited about, but I have to start with Black Panther because it's coming out soon, yay! But Ronald L. Smith, author of Hoodoo, wrote a Black Panther, The Young Prince, which is a fast-paced, adventurous tale about the young Black Panther's experience. And then Love, Sugar, and Magic follows Leo, who discovers her mother and sister are brujas, and they're able to bake magic spells into their pastries. So those are two that I'm really excited about, but the rest are really great too. And then in young adult, we have Anger is a Gift, which is described as an LGBT cross between The Hate You Give and Dear Martin, which follows a young boy who witnessed police violence in his past and now has to confront it in his present. I want to point out Let's Talk About Love, which is the title, unfortunately, that Voya got in a lot of trouble for reviewing with microaggressions, but it follows Alice, who is Black and asexual as she discovers who she is and what she wants from a relationship. Gloria Chow's American Panda is a contemporary debut about a Taiwanese American teen whose parents want her to be a doctor and marry a Taiwanese Ivy Leaguer despite her squeamishness with germs and a crush on a Japanese classmate. And because I am such a geek for speculative fiction, I put up my top 2018 debuts from authors who I'm excited about. Daniel Clayton's The Bells is a dark, decadent, disturbing fantasy about how far people will go to obtain beauty. And Tommy Ediyami's Children of Blood and Bone follows. It's a West African fantasy about a character trying to bring back magic to her land. And this one has already been optioned for a film, so it's highly anticipated. So I know that was a very quick title overview, but I wanted to give time to address questions, and all of the titles and the months that they're coming out are in the notes of the PowerPoint, and there's many notes in the PowerPoint that link to references for what I've been talking about. And so I see a question from Amber. Yes, I will be sending a copy of the presentation. Yes, and I apologize for talking so quickly. I have so much to say and share. So yes, right after this presentation ends, I'll make the video and send out the handouts and presentation to everyone. And then we have a question from Webb. I've been making a conscious effort to display diverse titles in my library. I've almost stopped reading books with white characters in my story time, but that leaves me with a lot of animal books. That illustration from 2015 representation feels really accurate to my collection, sure. It feels like while I'm avoiding white faces, I'm left with mostly animals. Yes, that is true. I'd like to build up my collection, but I also want to stay current, caught up to the other branches in my system. We're a 12-branch system, and each branch selects its own titles. Is my answer stop buying what others are buying and catch up on diverse titles? Thank you, Sarah. So I think it's a balance, really. You're always going to have your patrons wanting the titles that everyone wants, which may not be representative. So I think thinking about how we can start to change what our patrons want by doing our displays with more balance is important. But I don't think it's only show these, only promote these, but it's promote these with the ones that are popular. And I like doing read-alikes. Like if you liked Harry Potter, this popular title, you may like this other one. So not denying, I don't speak on this issue to say that we should deny white voices or animal stories, but just to include is important. But really asking, if you don't have those past titles that have been diverse, and making the decision of what is important for you to build up on. So I wouldn't say no to taking an initiative to go back and buy more titles now that have representation as well. So I think I feel like I didn't answer completely, but I really do think it's a balance, because at the end of the day, we do have to service our population and our patrons, and many of them want what they know, and what they know may not be diverse titles. So how can we get them to want that, but also highlight what we have too? That's good. Does that help to answer that question? Okay, great. Thanks. And I'm making the assumption that your branch has like interlibrary loan and a sharing system. So maybe you could be the branch that has the multicultural literature. And if that's your budget and your focus, you can share then with other branches. Oh, great. Awesome. I want to come visit your branch. Are there any other questions? Thank you, Amber. Oh, yay, Jennifer. Jennifer says she's a school library journal reviewer, and this was helpful. I'm so happy to hear that. I review as well from Voya, and I really do think that we have to keep having these critical conversations. We have to keep telling ourselves, like, don't default white and not write explicit descriptions, and really think that, like, oh, is this portrayal kind of negative? Should I write about it? I really do think it's important for us as reviewers to kind of push back and include the critique and include the explicit. For me, it's very much making an effort to include the explicit descriptions. I think that really will help to push our journals forward in being valuable for us. Oh, great. That's a big system. I just have my little center. But this is great. I'm happy to continue to answer questions and to continue to share resources if you have any later, or if more people after seeing this from your branch have questions. I'm happy to have conversations and share what I know and share other people who know more than me. Oh, Amber, that's a great question. How does a library determine what groups to focus on, like like Spanish, Korean, STEC? I'm not sure what that stands for, but uh, I think okay. So this question, I think it's important to represent your patron population, starting there. Like, what is your patron base and what specific needs do they have? But also recognizing the importance of having those windows for your patrons. So I've serviced their needs. Now, what else can I provide to help them see outside of their experiences? And so one thing that I didn't mention that I think is really helpful is trying to do a diversity audit of your collection to just see where you are, to see what you have, and so to then use that to fill in the gaps for providing those windows. So Karen Jensen from School Library Journal, she does the Teen Library Toolbox, has great resources on how to do diversity audits. And I will share that link in my resource handout. But I really do think it's what do you have, and what can you fill in, and what else do you need? Because everyone needs to see other groups. But we also need to surface our base first too. Does that help to answer your question, Amber? Oh, yes. Great. And Keeley says we did a diversity audit of our picture books and it was pretty eye-opening. I recommend it. Yes, I think it's really great to do like, what do we have, but to also audit what you're collecting now. Like, as you're collecting, making a little tally of like what this book has based on what I can see from the reviews or from the blogs, what characters are represented, and doing a tally for the ones that you're purchasing now. I think that's a really great way to start having it be something that sticks, like a process that sticks with you and makes you think more about it in your everyday collection development, but also looking back to what your collection already has is really important. Like, what is missing? What can you fill in? Oh, thank you, Miss Bracy. Thank you. We have just a few more minutes. If you have any more questions, go ahead and put them in the chat box. I'm going to move to the really exciting part. If you are a live participant today, you will be entered into a giveaway. 3 participants will receive a grab bag mailing of books that are highlighted here. You won't know what you get until you get it in the mail. But I thank you so much for being here. And I wanted to share with you some of my favorites from last year. So I'm going to send them out to you. And so if you get an email within the hour from me saying congratulations, you have won. Great. Thank you all for being here. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, well, it looks like no one has any more questions, but feel free to get in touch with me. I will be in touch with the recording, the webinar slides, and resources. So please feel free to get in touch and ask me questions and continue the conversation. Hope you all have a great day.